Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast regulars Wayne Winegarden, PRI Senior Fellow in Business and Economics, and Kerry Jackson, PRI Fellow at our Center for California Reform, joined forces to discuss their new study on San Francisco's homeless. San Francisco, arguably one of the wealthiest cities in the nation, is also one of the worst homeless problems. Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chatted with Wayne and Kerry about the homeless in San Francisco, just how bad it is, the problems that have contributed to homelessness, such as a high cost of housing, mental illness, and substance abuse, and their recommendations for helping to mitigate the problem. Thanks for joining us for this important topic. Welcome to Next Round, Wayne and Kerry.
Thanks. Great to be here again.
So you both joined forces to take a look at the homeless situation in San Francisco. Let's start with the basics. Just how bad is San Francisco's homeless problem today? I make a trip to San Francisco about every month because, as our listeners know, PRI's headquarters is located at the heart of the financial district in San Francisco. And I would estimate that there are probably about 3 to 5 homeless people in the financial district alone. And this is, if you remember, this financial district is the heart of San Francisco major financial institutions like Transamerica, Wells Fargo, Charles Schwab, the old Montgomery Securities. We're on Montgomery Street, the old Robertson Stevens. So this should be a sparkling, beautiful area, but instead we have what we have. So you've got the statistics. How does San Francisco compare to other cities in California and nationally?
Well, it is a disgrace. It's a shame that the city has been allowed to fall into that state of squalor. It's a beautiful place, and now it seems very blighted. As you say, it's beginning to be hard to tell when you walk into the difference between Skid Row and other parts of the city, because the homelessness situation is just overflowing. It's not one corner or one area. It's just going in every sidewalk it seems that you're stepping on, you're going to have to avoid somebody who's laying there or sitting there or something they've left behind. I think in a lot of other cities around the country it is making a comparison. You can still know when you go in, you enter into Skid Row, you go into the bad parts of town away from, as you say, a financial district in San Francisco or some other central business district or tourist area. You know when you're going into one, entering in from one and into the other. But the tourists in San Francisco, there's some who thought they've actually stumbled into Skid Row when they were still in places where tourists, business people, residents, shoppers, where they frequent. So I think this may be a unique part of what's going on in San Francisco, and maybe signals what's going to be happening in big cities around the rest of the country if things aren't taken care of.
Well, I'm the stats guy, but to put how bad what Kerry was saying, put that in perspective. New York City, right? Their homeless population is about 45 per 100,000. In San Francisco, you're talking about 492 per 100,000. So that's almost more than 10 times the rate. It's actually more than 10 times New York's rate, and that it just on a proportional basis, it is San Francisco is the worst in the country.
So, Wayne, I can attest to that. I find myself going to San Francisco to PRI's headquarters about every 6 to 8 weeks or so, and I always take Amtrak, and there's a little bus that lets you off in front of the Hyatt, and it's about a 10-minute walk along Market Street to get to PRI's office, and every time now, I find myself doing two things. Number one, of course, holding my nose from just the bad smell of everything, and number two, staring straight down at my feet for fear of stepping into feces or some other unknown substance on the street there. And when I am walking along and seeing this site, I always wonder, how did it get this way? What are some of the causes of homelessness in San Francisco? And are there factors that are unique to San Francisco, or are there root causes like what you'd find in New York or Los Angeles or other big cities in America?
That's a great question, Tim. And it's something that Kerry and I spent a lot of time talking about, thinking about, and researching for the study. And it's important to differentiate between those factors that are unique, certainly to California and in a large sense San Francisco, and those that differ from the rest of the country. San Francisco, some of the homelessness, like anywhere, you have problems of substance abuse, you have divorce and separation, things that kind of create family stress, and that can can lead to financial distress and homelessness, medical problems and costs. Those are national problems and they need to be addressed everywhere. But there are some unique factors to San Francisco, particularly because of the economic factors, given how unaffordable housing is in San Francisco, given all of the zoning requirements, CEQA, obviously that's California writ large, but all of these factors are unique to San Francisco. And in fact, it adds another layer of the homelessness problem that is unique to California and San Francisco.
I think I don't want to say the folks who are excusing growth in homelessness in San Francisco and Los Angeles, San Diego as well, the big cities on the coast will say, well, there's an attraction out here. People like the weather, so they're going to come and they're going to be homeless in nice weather. But the fact is the weather has been the same here a lot longer. It's been around longer than the homeless problem's most recent burst. So I don't think that particular uniqueness about it is something that is a factor. There's other things below the surface that are attracting them here, and that's something that if the city officials are going to have to be honest about and find out exactly what it is, why these folks are coming. And in some cases, there's a permissive attitude. In some cases, you have a homeless industrial complex that doesn't want the people off the street, just wants to leave them there as if they're in some kind of endangered species that can't be touched, which dehumanizes them in a terrible way.
You know, we all know how wealthy San Francisco is. You've got the great startups, technology, venture capital, finance, and yet San Francisco receives national attention for the piles of garbage and human waste on the streets triggered by the city's homeless crisis. Describe just how bad the human waste problem is and some of the other problems caused by rampant homelessness that impact residents, workers, and tourists alike. I know I was a resident for about 15 years, and gosh, going into the bar, going into the public transportation, it's a fright, and you feel sorry for the people who have to take it every day. So, Kerry, what do you think?
Well, in researching the most recent brief Wayne and I did, I found where the NBC affiliate about a year ago went to downtown San Francisco and surveyed 153 blocks. And I'll quote from the report that they broadcast. They found large heaps of garbage, food, and discarded junk. The investigation also found 100 drug needles and more than 300 piles of feces throughout downtown. And this goes back, too, to what I was saying earlier about you don't know where Skid Row begins and where the nice parts of town are supposed to end. That kind of thing is just all being blurred there. So they said what they found in these blocks, they included popular tourist spots such as Union Square, major hotel chains, and also City Hall, schools, playgrounds, and a police station. And it's ugly. There's no doubt about that. And it is getting national, international infamy for being ugly. But there's also a public health hazard here. And you have rats, you have trash, you have diseases that are going to be growing out of this situation. And this kind of thing shouldn't be happening in a major American city in the 21st century. It shouldn't have happened in the 20th century, certainly, and even more so in the 21st century.
You have infectious disease experts comparing San Francisco, one of the great cities of the U.S., to some of the dirtiest slums in the world. And I think that pretty much says it all, that is just unacceptable. And when you have within all of that filth, you have antibacterial-resistant bacteria growing, which means you're now creating a public health problem for the homeless, but also for kind of the broader population as well, to the extent that these bacterial-resistant diseases get out. That's a real problem.
Wayne and Kerry, city officials in San Francisco obviously aren't sitting idly by while the homeless crisis grows worse. We've seen Mayor London Breed and other city officials devote a lot of their time and their public pronouncements to efforts to address the homeless crisis. So can you talk a little bit about the current government programs that aim to help San Francisco's homeless? How much are city taxpayers spending each year on these programs? And based on your research, how effective are they at getting people off the streets?
They're somewhat effective, but obviously, given the scope of the problem, they're not effective enough. I mean, right now, we still have about, 1,000-bed shortage in San Francisco. I believe that's the number. Right now, San Francisco is spending well over $200 million annually trying to address the problem. And the shelters, they're doing the best they can, but there's a lot of lack of communication, which I think is thwarting the efforts. And there are also problems with shelters shelters, so you have people who would prefer to be on the street than to be in the shelter. And that's a problem that needs to be addressed. Effectively, you need to make the shelter a more conducive place where people want to go, where they can get help, not just get a place to stay, but get a place that can help them get back on their feet. Remember, nationally, you're talking about, they say a chronically homeless person costs taxpayers about $36,000 a year. So, if you multiply that by the number of homeless people, you're coming up to real money beyond just those direct costs that we're spending.
I just had one quick thing regarding to the question of how effective these programs have been, and as Wayne says, they are not really up to task. And I think one stat, and I'll be the stat guy here, the data guy on this one, that stands out to me is the homeless population in San Francisco grew 17% over the last 2 years. That's a pretty big chunk of growth, and I think that's not a good track record, not something that the city can brag about. But I'll add this too. I think London Breed brings some openness to innovation, some energy, and some focus that I don't think had necessarily been there before. And I'm somewhat optimistic that she can get some things done if she can get some cooperation from other elected officials in the city.
I completely echo that. I mean, the fact that the conversation is so prevalent shows that everybody is getting serious. And so hopefully there is reason for optimism that we'll get a handle on it.
As a former San Francisco resident, I'm actually kind of pessimistic about it, because even if we had the money, they authorized the money to build a shelter, and businesses, as in Prop C, the tax increase, we create these shelters. You've got the San Francisco NIMBYs who don't want a building in their community, or you have as we mentioned earlier, the CEQA regulations. It could take several years to actually even build a building with all the permitting, et cetera, in San Francisco. So I think it's a huge task ahead for these local officials. But we talked about, or you mentioned in your study, Prop C, which is a tax increase on businesses to help combat homelessness. How do you think this is going to work, and do you think it'll make a dent in the homelessness situation?
I have a couple of thoughts about that. One, I don't think the city needs to become a stronger magnet for the homeless than it already is by increasing services, nor to create any incentives for people to give up whatever struggles they're going through and decide they'll let this program, Prop C, take care of them. The other thought is the tax itself is, so they want to raise $300 million a year on this, but there are going to be some businesses who are going to say, I can't take this tax and I'm going to have to leave. And they're going to take with them the tax revenue that they generate and they're leaving the city. And businesses, like people, vote with their feet. And the city's political leaders need to think about what that means and keep an eye on Prop C as they go along.
Kerry's spot on. I would add that you don't make a city more affordable by raising taxes on the city. If one of the unique drivers of homelessness in San Francisco is the lack of affordability, and that's housing, but it goes through all of the necessities are more expensive. If you throw a tax on, it raises costs throughout the citywide economy. You're making the city less affordable. And so you need to be careful of those dynamic effects and make sure that in trying to address the problem, you're not actually pushing more people over the edge.
Now, a lot of your study is devoted to one of the root causes, which is San Francisco's astronomical housing costs. Based on your study, how are local policies in San Francisco driving up the costs of home building? And what are some reforms that you recommend to bring housing costs down in the city?
Well, I think Roe talked about a number of these already. You talk about CEQA, you talk about zoning laws. All of these make it take a long time to actually build affordable housing. And with some of the zoning laws, you can't build 2-3 unit housing. It has to be single unit housing. All of these things push up costs. And it also takes a long time to actually build housing, or particularly affordable housing. Plus, when you have all of these regulatory costs involved, that actually makes it more expensive to build, which means you're not going to build as much affordable housing. You're going to end up building high-end housing because there's such a large fixed cost in terms of construction. Well, that's kind of what you see. The housing that gets built is more, upper-end housing because all of the regulatory costs are pushing up. So we need to address those regulations. Another thing we need to address is rent control, right? The fact that you have rent control is a huge discouragement for landlords and for people to expand the housing stock, particularly the affordable housing stock. So getting rid of rent control actually is going one of the more important kind of reforms that would actually expand the housing supply. I think one of the most important things we need to do is lower the cost of building housing and expand and incent the expanding of housing, and not necessarily just single family.
I put this in perspective, or how difficult it is to build in San Francisco for building housing. There is a development in northern Los Angeles County, northwest Los Angeles County, called Newhall Ranch. And it is just now, I believe they finally broke ground in March 2019. And it's somewhere around that time. It took 25 years from the beginning of plans for this and then the process of getting permits to get this development going. And it's supposed to be unbelievably green. It's going to be green beyond anybody's imagination. Yet it still took 25 years, court hearings, public hearing, a permit, things just dragging on and on and on to get this development. And it's green. It's not it's not a chemical plant. It's not a coal-powered utility, anything like that. It's housing, and it's going to be some business. That's how difficult it is to build in an undeveloped part of California. Imagine the difficulty of building in a developed and very dense city like San Francisco and dealing with the same kind of restrictions and maybe even more.
So let's turn to some of your recommendations for city leaders, starting with shelter. You talk about one innovative idea for short-term shelter with a rather unique way for paying for it. Talk about your idea and some of your other recommendations for short and long-term shelter.
Well, I'll just say a couple of quick things and let Wayne jump in after that. But I want to give him credit for coming up with what I thought was a brilliant idea. You were just talking about that. And that's reallocating funds from the city's street cleaning budget. And that would be about $30 million just for cleaning streets. I think the sanitation budget is around $65 million the entire, but half of that's dedicated to cleaning streets. And it's become expensive again. We've talked about how human feces and urine and trash are all over the place. So he suggests reallocating a good portion of these funds for immediate shelter, immediate housing, getting folks off the street, the folks who are creating these trash piles and these piles of feces and the urine running in the streets. And if you can use that money in a different way, then you're going to have less of the problem that you're finding on the street. I also like to mention a program I think is fascinating. I had not heard of until doing research, and it's reuniting homeless with their family. Santa Barbara, Santa Monica have had success doing this. I believe it's also Anaheim has had some success in doing this, and the research on these programs has been very positive as to what they can do.
I agree with everything Kerry just said. I think the only thing I would add on top of that is we also need shelter to be created now, and we need some sort of regulatory relief where we can build some type of innovative shelter. And San Diego has a great project where they're effectively like tents, but it's these huge dorms. They have internet. They have all sorts of resources for homeless people. Pets are welcome into it, and it creates a comfortable place where somebody can get off of the street, and not just get off the street. It connects them with people that can help them get their lives back on track. And I think turn into innovative solutions like that so that we can get these needed shelters in the capacity that we need out there now, that also doesn't just work on housing, but it works on how to transition people back to be able to take care of themselves, to afford their own home. I think that's just invaluable.
Wayne and Kerry, you make the case that law enforcement can play a bigger role in helping the homeless. How so? And what are some examples of law enforcement successfully helping the homeless in other cities?
Yeah, North Dakota has a great example. I mean, what you're really talking about is the police are, by kind of definition of their job, they're on the front lines. They're interacting with homeless people all of the time, but they're not going to necessarily have the information that there's a great substance abuse facility that's down the street, or where the best shelter for an individual might be. And so if we could, and this is what North Dakota did, if we could use that knowledge that the police have and connect that with either a private organization that can help facilitate where that person goes, or even someone from the city, but basically use the police as a means to transition a lot the homeless people out from their current situation and into a better situation, because they actually are the ones who are interacting with the homeless on a regular basis.
When you talk about homelessness, it's not all about people who are down on their luck. Mental illness and substance abuse play a pretty big role. What do you recommend city leaders do to address the homeless who are battling these serious issues?
these people quite obviously need help. And it's a sad situation to see human beings in the state they're in. I don't think, and Wayne and I discussed this, that California has a greater share of mentally ill and homeless than others. And that takes us back to, well, why is it so, why do we have such high numbers? And again, we get back to the housing issue. Back to the mentally ill substance abusers who tend to make up a great deal or a great portion of the homeless. It looks to us, what's been tried through the decades just isn't working, because you're getting greater numbers and you're certainly not getting any lower numbers. And there are questions about institutionalizing people against their will and how to balance that with the public interest of reducing homelessness as much as possible. We talk about this from time to time, but we're hoping we can come up with some innovative solutions to this, because it's a tough one. And if we can ourselves, at least in our research going forward, we'll find some sources who are dealing with this and have been able to use effective programs or effective methods. It's a tough, to use a cliche, tough nut to crack. It truly is.
Well, finally, homeless programs are not all about government. You profile some private charities and nonprofit organizations that are making a real difference in addressing homelessness both in the short and long term. So tell us what some of these organizations are doing and how their programs could be adapted to address the problem in San Francisco.
Well, this is one organization. It's called Shelters to Shutters. I think I've been referring to this throughout our time today. They're a nonprofit. They work with private businesses, and basically they're about not just getting people to shelters, but also they work with apartment management companies to get the people jobs, right? And that's where the shutters comes in, where you're helping them go from being on the street to getting shelter to getting kind of work skills that then allows them to become independent. And obviously, it's not 100% successful, but they've had great success in moving people from the street kind of through that entire process. And so I think that program is incredibly interesting, and we need to learn from that to see, how can we apply that concept to San Francisco?
Yeah, I agree with that. When I first learned about this organization and the way it deals with this, I don't want to say I was necessarily surprised, but I was impressed and it was inspiring. And I will say, back to private sector solutions, I visited Father Joe's Villages in San Diego not long ago, and Lance Azumi from Pacific Research Institute went down there. And from what we could see, and from what the organization's literature puts out, it's making great strides in helping homeless people, taking them off the street, equipping them for getting back out into the world and being productive. And you see these people and you hear the stories, and you become, there's a sadness on one end, but then if they can make it through, there's certainly an inspiration on that end. But San Francisco has a similar institution called the Raphael House, and I think both institutions and others similar like them learn from each other. I certainly think that city officials could learn from both of them if they would decide that this is, if they would look back and say, well, maybe what we're doing is not being as effective as it should be. But I think the future of homeless care and homeless reduction is in the private sector, not in the public sphere. I'm fully convinced of that.
Thanks so much, Kerry and Wayne. And I just want to add that this is just, we're just scratching the surface here in terms of our work on homelessness and poverty. Wayne and Kerry are also going to do a more in-depth study next year, not just on San Francisco, which is this brief focused on, but the entire state. So thanks so much. And we look forward to reading that next study.
Thank you.
For Tim Anaya, Kerry Jackson, and Wayne Winegarden, thanks for joining us. And if you're interested in reading more about PRI's Homeless Brief, go to pacificresearch.org. If you haven't signed up for the joint PRI and Claremont 40th Anniversary Cruise, there's still some cabins left. The Mediterranean cruise starts in Barcelona with stops in Monte Carlo, Florence, Mallorca, and Rome. And at the end of the cruise, there'll be a special tour of the Vatican. For more information, go to ci-pri.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.